Snow falls on Poplar Street, each flake settling like memory on the steps where a mother once stood. December 7, 1978. The evening Madeleine Furey-Livaudais opened her door to darkness. For 44 years, that door remained a question mark in Denver's history. A gentle writer's life cut short by a stranger's blade. Her daughters left to grow up in the shadow of unanswered why. The killer vanished into time itself. Police files yellowed. Christmas lights blinked on other streets, while Poplar Street carried its wound forward. Season after season. But time has a way of keeping secrets and telling them both. Technology advances. DNA speaks where voices once fell silent. Bones yield truth from Texas soil. In 2021, science reached into a grave and pulled out a name. Joe Michael Ervin. 4 women, 1 killer. Justice delayed but not denied. The snow still falls on Poplar Street, but now it covers something different. Not just a question, but an answer written in code older than memory. What happens when the dead finally speak? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The winter of 1978 settled over Denver like a quiet promise, snow dusting the sidewalks, Christmas lights beginning their cheerful rebellion against the early darkness. Park Hill neighborhood felt insulated from the world's troubles, a pocket of suburban tranquility where children played in yards and mothers called them home for dinner. Madeleine Furey-Livaudais moved through her kitchen with practiced grace, the smell of pot roast filling the warm air. At 33, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had found her rhythm writer, mother, keeper of small daily rituals. Her daughters' voices drifted from the living room, their laughter mixing with the soft hum of December. 6:45. The golden hour when day surrenders to night. The knock came sharp against the front door. Not the gentle rap of a neighbor or the cheerful rhythm of a friend. Something urgent. Something wrong. Madeleine wiped her hands on her apron, glancing toward the living room where her daughters played. The porch light illuminated falling snow but little else. Through the glass, she could make out a tall figure, a man she didn't recognize, his posture tense against the cold. She turned the lock. The door opened to reveal a stranger whose eyes held something darker than the December night. In the space of a heartbeat, her world tilted. He pushed past her threshold, his presence filling the warm house like ice water. The kitchen knife appeared in his hand as if materialized from shadow. What followed lasted mere minutes but echoed across decades. The blade found its mark with calculated precision. No words exchanged, no explanation offered, just violence swift and senseless, leaving behind only silence and the terrible stillness of interrupted life. By dawn, crime scene tape fluttered like prayer flags around the house on Poplar Street. Detective cars lined the curb. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, their breath visible in the cold air as they whispered questions no one could answer. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Denver police headquarters, its light filtering through windows that had witnessed countless stories of human darkness. Detective Linda Morrison stood before a bulletin board that had become an altar to the unsolvable photographs of victims whose voices had been silenced, their cases growing cold like the December air outside. Madeleine's photo joined their ranks, a gentle face framed by dark hair, eyes that still seemed to hold questions. The crime scene photos told a different story, one of violence that had no place in the quiet world she'd built. The blood pattern analysis revealed defensive wounds on her hands. She had fought. The kitchen floor held fibers that didn't belong, traces of a presence that had invaded and vanished. A partial fingerprint on the doorframe offered the only real hope, a whorl pattern pressed into wood, like a signature written in skin oils in desperation. No forced entry except the door latch, Morrison noted, her pen scratching across yellow legal paper. No sexual assault, no robbery, personal effects untouched. The brutality felt intimate despite the absence of any connection between victim and perpetrator. This wasn't random violence, it was surgical, calculated, purposeful in ways that defied understanding. Evening news broadcasts carried Madeleine's story across Denver's living rooms. Denver mother slain in home police hunt attacker. Her photograph appeared on television screens while families gathered for dinner, a reminder that safety was always more fragile than it seemed. The phone lines buzzed with tips that led nowhere. Neighbors reported a dark sedan idling near Poplar Street, but no matching vehicle surfaced in the investigation. The partial fingerprint found no match in Denver's database. Each lead dissolved like snow in sunlight. As Christmas approached, the case file grew thicker but no closer to resolution. The evidence spoke of a killer who had been careful, methodical, ghost-like in his ability to appear and vanish without trace. The funeral for Madeleine Furey-Livaudais drew hundreds to the chapel on a gray January morning. Writers, neighbors, friends, and strangers united by the senselessness of her death filled every pew. Her daughters sat in the front row beside their father, small figures in dark dresses, their faces carrying the bewildered look of children trying to understand a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. The pastor spoke of a life devoted to words and wonder, of a woman who found magic in everyday moments and tried to capture it on paper. Her unfinished manuscripts lay in boxes at home: children's stories about nature, essays on the changing seasons, fragments of a voice that would never speak again. At the crime lab, technicians carefully cataloged the evidence from Poplar Street. The technology of 1979 offered limited options. Blood typing revealed O-positive traces on the doorframe, but DNA analysis remained years in the future. The torn sleeve from Madeleine's blouse yielded male genetic material, but the sample was too small and degraded for the primitive testing methods available. Detective Morrison submitted the evidence anyway, knowing that science advanced faster than justice. Somewhere in those microscopic traces lay the identity of a killer, but the tools to read that signature didn't yet exist. Denver's newspapers ran columns about rising urban violence, about doors that no longer felt safe to open, about the erosion of trust in neighborhoods that had once felt protected from the world's darkness. The Park Hill area organized a women watch patrol, neighbors taking turns walking the streets during evening hours. But memory fades. Other crimes demanded attention. Budget cuts forced the shelving of new testing equipment that might have processed the trace evidence. By spring, Madeleine's case had joined the growing pile of unsolved files, another question mark in the endless catalog of human mystery. The box containing her evidence was labeled simply, Furey-Livaudais, M. Homicide, status, unsolved. It would remain unopened for decades. August 10, 1980. The construction worker found her at dawn, lying beside a West Denver roadway like discarded refuse. Dolores Barajas, 53 years old, had been stabbed multiple times with the same calculated precision that had killed Madeleine 20 months earlier. The responding officers noted the similarities, immediately the angle of the wounds, the methodical nature of the attack, the absence of sexual assault or robbery. But in 1980, different jurisdictions meant different databases, different filing systems, different investigators who rarely compared notes across departmental lines. The crime lab processed what evidence they could. Unknown male DNA appeared again, matching the profile from the Furey-Livaudais case, but computer systems lacked the sophistication to make automatic comparisons. The connection existed in biological fact but remained invisible to human investigation. Spanish-language radio stations began calling the perpetrator El Fantasma de Denver, the Phantom of Denver, a ghost who struck without warning, without pattern, without mercy. Police departments failed to coordinate their findings. Jurisdictional pride and bureaucratic inefficiency created silos of information that should have been shared. Each case remained isolated, a single data point instead of part of a larger, more terrifying picture. 4 months later, downtown Denver's nightlife district became the hunting ground. Gwendolyn Harris, 27, vibrant and full of life, left the Mockingbird Lounge on a December evening that felt thick with snow and possibility. She vanished between the bar's neon-lit entrance and the parking lot where her car waited. Her body was discovered 3 days later in an alley, stabbed with the same methodical precision that had become a signature. A bar napkin clutched in her hand, a strand of hair preserved beneath her fingernails, evidence that would prove crucial decades later, but meant nothing to the limited forensic capabilities of 1980. The same unknown male DNA profile appeared for the third time. 3 women, 3 similar attacks, 3 jurisdictions, working in isolation. Public fear escalated as word spread through unofficial channels, waitresses talking to bartenders, bartenders talking to customers, the slow spread of unease that precedes panic. Police departments continued to downplay any serial connection, each insisting their case was unique, isolated, unrelated to the others. The truth lived in test tubes and evidence bags, waiting for technology to catch up with reality. January 24, 1981. Adams County. The teenager's body lay half-buried in snow. Her 17-year-old life ended in a field that stretched white and empty toward the horizon. Antoinette Parks had been 8 months pregnant when the killer found her. 2 lives ended with the same methodical violence that had already claimed 3 other women. Investigators found a partial footwear print in the snow beside her body, a specific tread pattern that would prove significant years later. Fiber evidence consistent with automotive carpeting clung to her jacket. The crime scene spoke of careful planning, of a predator who had studied his victim's routine, and struck when she was most vulnerable. The shoe print matched a brand worn by construction workers and delivery drivers, common enough to be meaningless in 1981, specific enough to matter when technology finally caught up with justice. 4 women now connected by DNA that no one could read, by patterns that no one recognized, by a killer who moved through Colorado like smoke. The same unknown male profile linked Madeleine Furey-Livaudais, Dolores Barajas, Gwendolyn Harris, and Antoinette Parks in death, but bureaucratic inefficiency kept them isolated in investigation. Fear spread through Denver's neighborhoods like a virus. Women carried whistles. Doors stayed locked after dark. The evening news ran safety segments about trusting instincts, avoiding isolated areas, traveling in groups. But the killer's next target wouldn't be a random woman walking alone. June 13, 1981, Aurora, Colorado. Officer Deborah Sucor conducted what should have been a routine traffic stop. The driver, Joe Michael Ervin, carried stolen license plates and a concealed weapon. When Cor approached his vehicle, he shot her without warning, killing a dedicated police officer whose only crime was doing her job. Ervin fled but was arrested within hours. His fingerprints filled evidence bags. His photograph joined the booking records. His name entered the system that would, 40 years later, finally connect him to 4 murders. But in 1981, the technology didn't exist to link Ervin's prints to the partial print found at Madeleine's house. Computer databases couldn't cross-reference DNA profiles. The connections that seem obvious in hindsight remained invisible to the investigators of the time. Joe Michael Ervin died by suicide in his jail cell before trial, taking his secrets with him. Officer Cor received a hero's funeral. The case files were closed and filed away. 4 women remained unavenged, their killer unknown, their cases growing colder with each passing year. Time moved forward like water over stone, wearing away sharp edges, softening the urgency that had once driven the investigations. The 1980s became the 1990s. The 1990s became the new millennium. Technology advanced in ways the original investigators couldn't have imagined. DNA analysis evolved, from crude blood typing to sophisticated genetic profiling. Computer databases grew powerful enough to store and compare millions of data points. The Combined DNA Index System (CODIS) created a national network of genetic information that could link crimes across state lines and decades. In 2013, Detective Laura Jennings inherited a desk drawer full of cold cases that had outlived their original investigators. Among them sat a file marked Furey-Livaudais, M. Homicide. Status: unsolved. Jennings was part of a new generation of detectives analytically minded, technologically savvy, unencumbered by the jurisdictional rivalries that had hampered earlier investigations. Her office wall displayed photographs of victims whose voices had been silenced, their cases become her personal mission. She opened Madeleine's file on a Tuesday morning in October, 35 years after the murder. The evidence had been preserved according to protocols established long after the original investigation. Blood samples, fiber evidence, the precious DNA material that had been too degraded to analyze in 1978. Modern short tandem repeat analysis could extract genetic profiles from samples that earlier technology couldn't process. Jennings submitted the evidence for retesting, knowing that science had advanced far beyond what the original investigators could have imagined. The results came back on a Thursday. Unknown male DNA, clear enough for database comparison. Jennings entered the profile into CODIS and waited for the computer to search through millions of genetic signatures. 3 matches appeared on her screen. Dolores Barajas, Gwendolyn Harris, Antoinette Parks, 4 women, killed across 3 years, linked by genetic evidence that proved they had all encountered the same predator. What had been isolated tragedies suddenly became a connected pattern, a serial killer's signature written in DNA. The revelation reopened wounds that had never fully healed and created new ones. 4 families received phone calls that brought decades-old grief rushing back to the surface. 4 jurisdictions suddenly found themselves investigating a single perpetrator who had moved through Colorado like a ghost. But the killer's identity remained unknown. The DNA profile found no match in any database. The genealogical breakthrough came in 2021, when forensic science merged with family history research in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to the original investigators. Dr. Marcus Lynn, a forensic genealogist with the methodical precision of a watchmaker and the patience of an archaeologist, took on the Ervin DNA profile as a personal challenge. Working with genetic segments smaller than breadcrumbs, Lynn began mapping family trees through public genealogy databases. The unknown killer's DNA told a story of migration and marriage, of families moving west across America's expanding frontier, of surnames that appeared and disappeared across generations. The search led to Texas, to a family line that had produced farmers, laborers, and one man whose life had ended violently in a Colorado jail cell 40 years earlier. Joe Michael Ervin, born 1951, died by suicide 1981 while awaiting trial for the murder of Aurora police officer Deborah Sue Core. The name appeared in archived newspaper reports, in court documents, in the faded carbon copies of police reports that had been stored in boxes and forgotten. A man who had killed a police officer and died before facing justice, his connection to 4 other murders hidden by the technological limitations of his time. Lynn's discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Could the same man who had murdered Officer Core also be responsible for the deaths of Madeleine, Dolores, Gwendolyn, and Antoinette? The DNA suggested yes, but DNA from a man 40 years dead couldn't be tested, unless they dug him up. The legal battle for exhumation rights took months. Prosecutors argued that justice for 4 families outweighed the sanctity of the grave. Defense attorneys representing Ervin's surviving relatives objected to the disturbance of their family members' remains. Social media exploded with debates about the ethics of disturbing the dead in service of solving cold cases. Judge Maria Santos reviewed precedent cases, studied the legal framework for post-mortem DNA testing, and weighed the rights of the dead against the needs of the living. Her ruling came on a gray October morning. The public interest in solving 4 murders justified the exhumation of Joe Michael Ervin's remains. The decision made headlines across Texas and Colorado. TV crews gathered outside the Arlington Cemetery, where Ervin had been buried 4 decades earlier. The phrase "digging up the truth" began trending on social media as the public watched science attempt to solve crimes that had haunted 2 states for generations. November 15, 2021. Arlington, Texas. Under overcast skies that seemed appropriate for the grim work ahead, a team of forensic technicians carefully lifted Joe Michael Ervin's casket from the earth that had held it for 40 years. The exhumation proceeded with scientific precision. Bone fragments and tooth enamel samples were extracted under sterile conditions, each specimen carefully cataloged and preserved for transport to the Denver crime lab. The remains yielded high-quality genetic material DNA, preserved by the chemistry of death and the protection of sealed burial. Television cameras rolled at a respectful distance. Reporters narrated the unprecedented scene of justice reaching across 4 decades to touch the dead. The public watched with fascination as science attempted to give voice to victims who had been silenced by violence. In Denver, crime lab analysts prepared for the most important comparison of their careers. The DNA extracted from Ervin's remains would either solve 4 murders or eliminate the only suspect the investigation had identified. The results came back with mathematical certainty. STR loci alignment across multiple genetic markers. Probability of coincidental match, 1 in 4.8 quadrillion. Joe Michael Ervin's DNA matched the unknown male profile found at all 4 crime scenes. 43 years after Madeleine Furey-Livaudais opened her door to a stranger, science had finally identified her killer. The man who had also murdered Dolores Barajas, Gwendolyn Harris, and Antoinette Parks. The same man who had killed Officer Deborah Sue Core before taking his own life in jail. The revelation rewrote the history of 5 families and fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached cold case investigations. DNA databases, genealogical research, and post-mortem testing had combined to solve crimes that conventional investigation couldn't touch. But solutions bring their own complications. There would be no trial, no courtroom confrontation, no moment when the guilty faced their accusers. Justice had become a laboratory result, a statistical probability, a scientific conclusion rather than a legal verdict. The dead had spoken, but they offered no explanations, no remorse, no opportunity for closure through traditional means. January 12, 2022. The Denver Police Department and Adams County Sheriff's Office held a joint press conference in a downtown conference room packed with reporters, family members, and law enforcement officials. 4 photographs stood on easels behind the podium. Madeleine, Dolores, Gwendolyn, and Antoinette, their faces finally connected in death as they had been in life. Case solved. Read the headline that would appear in newspapers across the country. Detective Jennings stood at the microphone, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. She displayed DNA sequence overlays, investigative timelines, and the scientific evidence that had finally given names to the victim's killer. Joe Michael Ervin, a man who died in custody 41 years ago, has been positively identified as the perpetrator of 4 homicides that terrorized our community in the late 1970s and early 1980s. She announced, The room erupted with questions. How had the connection been missed for so long? What other cold cases might be solved using similar techniques? How many more victims might Ervin have claimed? Jennings answered what she could. The technological limitations of the 1970s and 1980s had made the connections impossible to detect at the time. Modern forensic genealogy was opening new possibilities for cold case resolution. Ervin's criminal history suggested violence dating back to the late 1960s, but evidence for additional crimes remained circumstantial. National media outlets picked up the story. Justice from the grave became the phrase that defined the case. Cable news programs devoted segments to the Bridget intersection of forensic science and genealogical research. The Ervin case became a template for cold case investigations across the country. But for the families, the headlines and television coverage felt secondary to a more personal reckoning. 4 women had finally been given their day in court, even if the court was a laboratory and the verdict was a DNA sequence. 3 days after the press conference, Madeleine's daughters spoke publicly for the first time since childhood. Standing in the same conference room where their mother's killer had been identified, they offered words that resonated far beyond the immediate audience. "It's like meeting her ghost through science," one daughter said, her voice carrying decades of grief and bewilderment. "We always knew she deserved justice. We just never imagined it would come from a grave in Texas." The interview was broadcast nationwide, their words touching millions of viewers who had followed the case through social media and news coverage. Spring 2022 brought a memorial service unlike any Denver had seen. Families, law enforcement, scientists, and community members gathered in Civic Center Park on a cloudy afternoon that seemed designed for reflection and remembrance. 4 candles burned on a simple altar, their flames steady despite the gentle breeze. Detective Jennings read the names of the victims, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd and the television cameras that broadcast the ceremony live. Madeleine Furey-Livaudais, writer, mother, lover of the natural world. Dolores Barajas, worker, daughter, taken on her way to provide for her family. Gwendolyn Harris, vibrant, social, full of life and laughter. Antoinette Parks, 17 years old, pregnant, carrying the future that was stolen from us all. The ceremony announced the launch of Project Madeleine, a new cold case initiative funded by a combination of federal grants and private donations. Advanced DNA analysis, genealogical research, and post-mortem testing would be applied to hundreds of unsolved murders across Colorado and neighboring states. Dr. Lynn spoke about the responsibility that came with the power to identify killers decades after their crimes. Science had given law enforcement tools that earlier generations couldn't imagine, but those tools came with ethical obligations to use them wisely and respectfully. The families of the victims offered their own reflections. They spoke of years spent wondering, of questions that had haunted their dreams, of the strange relief that came with finally knowing the truth, even when that truth brought no opportunity for traditional justice. Public trust in science-driven investigation reached new heights. DNA databases expanded as more people voluntarily submitted genetic information. Genealogy companies reported increased cooperation with law enforcement. The idea that science could give voice to the silenced resonated with a public hungry for justice in an uncertain world. But the emotional toll on investigators became apparent. Detectives and lab technicians reported difficulty sleeping, increased anxiety, and the psychological burden of constantly confronting human violence. The success of the Ervin case had opened floodgates of hope for other families, creating pressure and expectations that strained resources and emotional reserves. Summer brought reflection and a growing awareness that justice, even when achieved, never fully heals the wounds left by senseless violence. The archives of the Denver Police Department underwent a quiet transformation in the months following the Ervin identification. Boxes that had been labeled unsolved for decades were refiled under closed Ervin. The physical act of moving files from one section to another carried symbolic weight that wasn't lost on the department's records staff. Among Madeleine's effects, investigators discovered forgotten correspondence from environmental organizations praising her advocacy work, letters from editors who had published her essays about Colorado's changing seasons, thank you notes from children who had heard her read her nature stories at local libraries. The Denver Post ran a retrospective piece calling her Denver's Voice of the Earth, highlighting her environmental activism and her efforts to preserve open spaces around the city. Her unfinished children's book about a family of owls learning to navigate urban expansion found new relevance in a city still struggling with development and conservation. Archivists debated whether to reopen parallel cases in Texas, where Ervin had lived before moving to Colorado. His criminal history suggested violence dating back to the late 1960s, but the evidence remained fragmentary and circumstantial. Limited resources forced difficult decisions about which cases deserved renewed investigation. Fall brought national attention as the case became a featured presentation at the National Cold Case Symposium in Washington, D.C. Detective Jennings and Dr. Lynn stood before an audience of law enforcement professionals, forensic scientists, and victim advocates, presenting slide decks filled with DNA triangulation charts and genealogical mapping techniques. The presentation sparked immediate interest from other jurisdictions. Police departments across the country began reviewing their oldest unsolved cases, identifying those with preserved biological evidence that might yield to modern testing. The Ervin case became a template, a proof of concept that time and technological advancement could overcome even the most challenging investigative obstacles. But success brought ethical complications. Privacy advocates raised concerns about the use of genealogical databases for law enforcement purposes. Some genealogy companies restricted police access to their data. Legal experts debated the boundaries of post-mortem DNA testing and the rights of the deceased's family members. The intersection of science and justice proved more complex than headlines suggested. Winter 2022 found Madeleine's daughters standing on the sidewalk outside their childhood home on Poplar Street. The house had changed ownership multiple times over the decades, but the bones of the structure remained the same. The front porch where their mother had welcomed friends, the door that had opened to violence on a December evening 44 years earlier. Current residents had learned the history of their home from news coverage of the case. They had invited the daughters to visit, understanding the importance of closure and connection to place. The women stood quietly in the cold air, their breath visible as they remembered a time when the house had been filled with their mother's voice. One daughter carried a newspaper clipping in her purse, case solved. After 44 years that she had read so many times, the paper had become soft as fabric. The headline represented justice, but it also marked the end of hope. For decades, they had believed their mother's killer might still be alive, might still face trial, might still offer explanations for what he had done. Knowing that he had been dead for 41 years brought a different kind of closure. Justice had been achieved, but it felt abstract, scientific, removed from the human need for confrontation and accountability. Neighbors gathered that evening to light candles on the anniversary of Madeleine's death. The ceremony had become an annual tradition in the years since the case was solved, a way for the community to honor her memory and acknowledge the long road to truth. The candles flickered in the December air, their light reflecting off windows and snow, creating a warm glow that pushed back against the winter darkness. Children who hadn't been born when Madeleine died listened to their parents explain why this evening mattered, why memory and justice intertwined in ways that transcended individual lives. Local television crews filmed the ceremony, but their coverage focused on community healing rather than sensational details. The story had evolved from true crime sensation to something deeper, a meditation on time, memory, and the persistence of love across decades of uncertainty. The evening ended with quiet conversations on snowy sidewalks, neighbors sharing stories of how the case had affected their sense of safety and community over the years. Spring 2023 brought documentary filmmakers to Denver, their cameras capturing the intersection of advanced forensic science and human persistence that had solved the Ervin case. The resulting film would air on streaming platforms and cable networks, reaching audiences far beyond Colorado's borders. Reporters interviewed Detective Jennings in the same conference room where the case's resolution had been announced. Behind her, evidence photos and DNA charts created a visual timeline of the investigation's evolution from 1978 to 2022. Her words carried the weight of personal investment and professional satisfaction. The filming process revealed details that had been overlooked in earlier coverage. Ervin's name had appeared in a 1978 arrest log. He had been questioned about a minor theft just 6 blocks from Madeleine's house 2 weeks before her murder. The proximity felt significant in hindsight, though it would have meant nothing to investigators at the time. Public reaction to the documentary reignited empathy for victims whose cases remained unsolved. Online forums filled with amateur investigators trying to connect DNA evidence to genealogical databases. Social media campaigns emerged around other cold cases, families hoping that publicity might inspire the attention that had finally brought justice for Madeleine, Dolores, Gwendolyn, and Antoinette. But the attention also raised uncomfortable questions. How many other killers had died before facing justice? How many families would never receive the closure that advanced science had provided to these 4 cases? How many victims remained voiceless, their killers protected by time and technological limitations? Critics argued that closure without traditional courtroom justice lacked emotional satisfaction. Supporters countered that DNA identification provided something even more valuable: certainty. Families finally knew who had destroyed their loved ones, even if they couldn't confront him in person. The Denver Police Department issued a formal closure statement for all 4 cases in late spring. The document, signed by the chief of police and witnessed by the mayor, officially declared that Joe Michael Ervin had been identified as the perpetrator of 4 homicides committed between 1978 and 1981. Officer Deborah Sue Corr's family received honorary recognition, linking her courage during the fatal traffic stop to the eventual closure of the 4 cold cases. Her death had put Ervin in the system, creating the paper trail that would decades later allow genealogical researchers to identify him as the serial killer. Summer 2023 saw the implementation of Project Madeleine at crime labs across Colorado and neighboring states. Federal funding combined with private donations to purchase advanced DNA sequencing equipment and hire specialized technicians trained in forensic genealogy. The project's first year identified potential suspects in dozens of cold cases dating back to the 1960s. Some investigations led to arrests of elderly perpetrators still alive after decades of freedom. Others, like the Ervin case, revealed killers who had died before facing justice, providing closure without legal resolution. Local news outlets reported each breakthrough with headlines that emphasized the triumph of science over time. DNA gives voice to the voiceless became a recurring theme in coverage that portrayed forensic genealogy as a tool of justice and remembrance. But the emotional toll on analysts and investigators became increasingly apparent. Laboratory technicians reported difficulty separating professional responsibilities from personal reactions when processing evidence from particularly violent crimes. Victim advocates began providing counseling services specifically for law enforcement personnel working cold cases. The success of advanced forensic techniques created unrealistic expectations among some families of unsolved murder victims. Not every case had preserved biological evidence suitable for modern testing. Not every DNA profile could be connected to genealogical databases. Not every investigation led to identification of suspects. Managing hope while explaining limitations became a significant challenge for cold case detectives. They found themselves counseling families while pursuing scientific leads, balancing encouragement with realistic assessments of what technology could and couldn't accomplish. Dr. Lynn published research papers on the ethical implications of postmortem DNA testing, arguing for protocols that balance the rights of the deceased with the needs of victims' families. His work influenced policy discussions at state and federal levels, shaping legislation that would govern forensic genealogy for future generations. The intersection of science, law, and ethics proved more complex than early practitioners had anticipated. Success in solving cold cases came with responsibilities that extended far beyond individual investigations. December 7, 2023, marked the 45th anniversary of Madeleine Furey-Livaudais' murder. Candlelight glowed on Poplar Street as neighbors, family members, and community activists gathered for what had become an annual vigil, honoring not just her memory, but the memories of all victims whose voices had been silenced by violence. The ceremony had evolved from a neighborhood remembrance into a citywide event that drew participants from across the Denver metropolitan area. Children who had been born after the case was solved listened to their parents explain why this evening mattered, why communities must remember their lost members, why justice delayed was still justice achieved. Madeleine's daughters, now in their 50s, spoke about the strange journey from childhood trauma to adult closure. They described how DNA identification had provided answers they had stopped expecting, how science had given their mother a posthumous voice that resonated across decades of silence. The evening also marked the publication of Madeleine's collected writings, essays about nature, unfinished children's stories, letters to environmental organizations advocating for open space preservation. Proceeds from book sales funded forensic research scholarships at local universities, ensuring that future scientists would continue advancing the tools of justice. Local bookstores organized reading events featuring Madeleine's work. Environmental organizations quoted her essays in their advocacy campaigns. Her words, preserved in manuscripts that had gathered dust for decades, found new audiences and contemporary relevance. The vigil concluded with a moment of silence for all victims of unsolved crimes. Participants held candles that reflected off windows and snow, creating points of light that pushed back against the winter darkness. The ceremony felt both solemn and hopeful, acknowledging loss while celebrating the power of persistence and scientific advancement. Television coverage of the anniversary emphasized transformation rather than tragedy. Reporters focused on how the case had changed, cold case investigation, how families had found healing through scientific closure, how communities could honor their dead while working toward safer futures. The evening ended with quiet conversations on snowy sidewalks, neighbors sharing stories of how the case had affected their understanding of justice, memory, and the endurance of love. Across time, January 2024 brought reflective analysis as the Ervin case approached its second anniversary of resolution. Legal scholars studied the precedent established by post-mortem DNA testing. Forensic scientists refined techniques for extracting genetic material from degraded biological samples. Victim advocates developed new protocols for supporting families through the complex emotions that accompanied cold case closures. The case had fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached decades-old unsolved murders. DNA databases expanded as more jurisdictions invested in advanced testing equipment. Genealogical research became a standard investigative tool. Post-mortem testing was no longer experimental but accepted practice when warranted by the severity of crimes and the needs of victims' family. But questions remain. Dr. Lynn's final report noted the discovery of one unmatched DNA partial in evidence from a 1977 case, a genetic shadow that suggested Ervin's crimes might have begun earlier than investigators had determined. The fragment was too degraded for definitive analysis, but its existence haunted researchers who wondered how many other connections might be hidden in archived evidence. The discovery served as a reminder that even solved cases carried echoes of unsolved mysteries. Justice had been achieved for Madeleine, Dolores, Gwendolyn, and Antoinette, but their killer's full story might never be completely known. Media coverage of the case's second anniversary focused on its lasting impact rather than its sensational details. News programs featured segments on other cold cases solved using techniques pioneered in the Ervin investigation. Families of victims in those cases credited the publicity surrounding Madeleine's story with inspiring law enforcement to pursue genetic genealogy in their loved ones' cases. The ripple effects extended beyond individual investigations. Public trust in forensic science reached historic levels. DNA databases received unprecedented numbers of voluntary submissions from people hoping to help solve crimes in their communities. Genealogy companies reported increased cooperation with law enforcement despite ongoing privacy concerns. Educational institutions began offering specialized programs in forensic genealogy. Universities developed curricula that combined traditional detective work with genetic analysis and family history research. The next generation of investigators would graduate with tools that seemed like science fiction to the detectives who had first worked Madeleine's case in 1978. The Denver Police Department created a permanent exhibit honoring the 4 victims and showcasing the scientific breakthrough that had identified their killer. Displayed in the lobby of police headquarters, the exhibit featured photographs of Madeleine, Dolores, Gwendolyn, and Antoinette, alongside DNA sequence comparisons and genealogical charts that told the story of how their cases were finally solved. Visitors could trace the evolution of forensic technology from the crude blood typing available in 1978 to the sophisticated genetic analysis that had revealed Ervin's identity 43 years later. Interactive displays allowed people to understand how family trees could be mapped through DNA, how genetic databases connected distant relatives, how science had given voice to victims who had been silenced by violence. School groups toured the exhibit as part of science education programs. Students learned about the intersection of biology, technology, and justice while developing appreciation for the persistence required to solve complex problems. Teachers used the case as an example of how scientific advancement could address social problems that had seemed unsolvable. The exhibit also served as a memorial to Officer Deborah Sucor, whose courage during a routine traffic stop had ultimately led to the identification of a serial killer. Her photograph stood beside those of the 4 murder victims, recognizing her sacrifice and its unexpected contribution to their posthumous justice. Annual ceremonies at the exhibit brought together families, investigators, scientists, and community members who had been touched by the case. These gatherings served multiple purposes, honoring the dead, celebrating scientific achievement, and reinforcing community commitment to justice regardless of how much time had passed. Local artists contributed works inspired by the case paintings of snow-covered streets, sculptures representing the persistence of memory, musical compositions that captured the emotional journey from loss to closure. Art provided ways of processing trauma and transformation that transcended the factual details of criminal investigation. Spring 2024 brought renewed attention to environmental causes that Madeleine had championed during her abbreviated life. Urban planners studying her writings discovered prescient observations about development patterns that threatened Colorado's natural heritage. Her essays from the 1970s read like prophecy, accurately predicting conflicts between growth and conservation that dominated contemporary political discourse. Environmental organizations quoted her work in campaigns to preserve open space around Denver. Her words carried particular power because they came from a voice that had been silenced by violence, a reminder that every lost life represented unrealized potential for positive change. Activists spoke of continuing work that she had been unable to finish. The Madeleine Furey-Livaudais Memorial Fund, established with proceeds from her posthumously published writings, provided grants for environmental education programs in Denver public schools. Children learned about ecology and conservation while developing appreciation for how individual voices could influence community decisions. Her daughters participated in Earth Day celebrations, reading selections from their mother's writings and speaking about how her environmental advocacy had influenced their own life choices. They described growing up with a mother who noticed seasonal changes, who taught them to observe wildlife in urban settings, who believed that paying attention to the natural world was both spiritual practice and civic responsibility. The environmental legacy provided another form of justice, ensuring that Madeleine's ideas continued influencing the world decades after her death. Her voice lived on not just through DNA identification of her killer, but through ongoing work to protect the landscapes she had loved. Media coverage emphasized this broader legacy, portraying her not just as a crime victim, but as an advocate whose ideas remained relevant to contemporary challenges. Her story became an example of how violence could silence individual voices, but not eliminate their influence when communities chose to remember and continue their work. Summer brought the completion of the first comprehensive study of Project Madeleine's effectiveness. Researchers analyzed data from 57 cold cases that had been reopened using advanced DNA techniques and genealogical research. 23 cases resulted in suspect identification, including 12 living perpetrators who were arrested and 11 deceased suspects who were identified posthumously. The statistics represented more than bureaucratic success. They translated into families who finally knew what had happened to their loved ones, communities that could close psychological wounds that had festered for decades, law enforcement agencies that could redirect resources from unsolvable cases to active investigations. But the study also revealed limitations and challenges. 34 cases remained unsolved despite advanced testing, either because biological evidence had degraded beyond analysis or because genetic profiles couldn't be connected to genealogical databases. Success rates varied significantly based on the age of evidence, storage conditions, and the size of genetic databases available for comparison. Ethical considerations proved as complex as technical challenges. Some family members struggled with learning their loved one's killer had died without facing justice. Others felt conflicted about the privacy implications of genetic genealogy. A few questioned whether posthumous identification provided meaningful closure when it eliminated any possibility of confrontation or explanation. Dr. Lin published final recommendations for best practices in cold case genetic genealogy. His guidelines emphasize the importance of counseling support for families, transparent communication about limitations and possibilities, and respect for the privacy rights of genetic relatives who might be contacted during investigation. The recommendations influenced policy development at state and federal levels. Legislators crafted bills that would standardize protocols for genetic genealogy in criminal investigation while protecting privacy rights and ensuring adequate funding for psychological support services. Training programs for law enforcement personnel expanded to include sensitivity training about delivering news to families who had waited decades for answers. Investigators learned to manage expectations while providing hope, to explain scientific limitations while celebrating breakthroughs. Fall 2024 marked the establishment of the National Cold Case DNA Database, a federal initiative inspired partly by the success of the Ervin investigation. The database created standardized protocols for genetic analysis and genealogical research while protecting privacy rights and ensuring quality control across jurisdictions. Madeleine's case became a training example used by the FBI National Academy to teach advanced cold case investigation techniques. Her photograph appeared in textbooks and training materials, ensuring that future law enforcement officers would learn from the persistence and scientific innovation that had finally brought her killer to justice. The federal database represented more than technological advancement. It symbolized a national commitment to remembering the forgotten, to giving voice to the silenced, to ensuring that time alone could not protect killers from accountability. Every genetic profile entered into the system carried the potential to connect crimes across decades and state lines. International law enforcement agencies sent delegations to study American cold case techniques. The Ervin case became a model for solving decades-old murders in countries where genetic genealogy was just beginning to develop. Madeleine's story reached global audiences, inspiring investigators who faced similar challenges with limited technology and jurisdiction conflicts. Academic conferences featured presentations analyzing the psychological and social impacts of cold case resolution on families and communities. Researchers studied how scientific closure differed from traditional courtroom justice, how communities processed delayed answers to questions that had haunted them for generations. Victim advocacy groups developed specialized services for families experiencing cold case breakthroughs. Counselors trained in the unique emotional challenges of posthumous justice helped family members navigate complex feelings about learning their loved one's killer had died decades earlier. The services acknowledged that closure through DNA identification, while scientifically satisfying, created different emotional needs than traditional criminal prosecution. Families required support in processing decades of uncertainty, followed by definitive answers that eliminated any possibility of direct confrontation with perpetrators. December 7, 2024, brought the largest anniversary gathering yet held on Poplar Street. The 46th anniversary of Madeleine's murder drew participants from across the country, families of cold case victims, forensic scientists, law enforcement officers, and community members who had been inspired by the persistence that had finally brought truth to light. The evening began with readings from Madeleine's environmental writings, her words carrying across the snowy street where she had once walked with her daughters, where she had tended gardens, where she had lived the quiet life that violence had so brutally interrupted. Her voice, preserved in manuscripts and memory, spoke to contemporary audiences about the importance of paying attention to the natural world. Speakers included families of other cold case victims whose cases had been solved using techniques pioneered in the Ervin investigation. They spoke of hope sustained across decades of uncertainty, of the strange relief that came with scientific answers, of the importance of communities that refused to forget their lost members. Dr. Lynn addressed the crowd about the responsibility that came with the power to identify killers decades after their crimes. He emphasized that forensic genealogy was more than technique. It was a commitment to justice that transcended the limitations of individual lifespans, a promise that some questions would never stop being asked until they were answered. Detective Jennings, now retired but still carrying the emotional weight of dozens of solved and unsolved cases, spoke about the evolution of law enforcement's relationship with time. Cold cases had taught her that justice operated on schedules that extended far beyond typical career spans, that persistence across generations could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable to individual investigators. The ceremony concluded with the lighting of candles that reflected off windows in snow, creating points of light that pushed back against the winter darkness. Children held flames beside adults, symbolizing the transfer of memory and responsibility across generations. Snow fell softly as the crowd dispersed, each flake settling like memory on the street where tragedy had become transformation, where questions had become answers, where silence had finally been broken by the persistent voice of science and the enduring power of communities that refused to forget. The door on Poplar Street stood rebuilt and strong, its glass panels reflecting the warm light that spilled from within the house where Madeleine had once lived. New families had made the space their own, but they honored its history with small gestures, a plaque beside the front steps, flowers planted in memory of a woman they had never met, and understanding that some places carry stories larger than their current inhabitants. The neighborhood had changed over the decades since 1978. Trees had grown taller, streets had been repaved. Children who had played in yards during Madeleine's lifetime now brought their own children to visit the memorial that her story had become. But the essential character of the place remained a quiet street where people built lives, raised families, and trusted that opening their doors to unexpected knocks would not bring violence into their homes. The restoration of that trust represented another form of justice, a victory over the fear that murder always leaves in its wake. In laboratories across the country, scientists continued the work that had given Madeleine her posthumous voice. DNA profiles were compared to genetic databases, family trees were mapped through genealogical research, cold cases were reopened with tools that seemed miraculous to earlier generations of investigators. Each identification carried forward the legacy of persistence that had characterized the Ervin investigation. Victims who had been silent for decades found their stories told through the language of genetics and the dedication of people who refused to accept that time alone could protect killers from accountability. The snow continued falling on Poplar Street, covering the sidewalks where Madeleine had once walked, settling on the steps where she had stood on the last evening of her life. But now the snow covered something different, not just the scene of an unsolved crime, but the location where science and persistence had finally brought truth to light. Her story had become larger than the individual tragedy that had ended her life. It represented the power of communities to remember their lost members, the ability of technology to overcome the limitations that had frustrated earlier generations, and the enduring truth that some questions would never stop being asked until they were finally answered. The light spilling through the door on Poplar Street illuminated more than a single house. It represented the victory of memory over forgetting, of justice over time, of voices that refused to be permanently silenced by violence. Justice had come from the grave, carried on the genetic winds that connected past to present, the dead to the living, questions to answers that had waited 43 years to be spoken aloud.